Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast. Ari Yampolsky is a lawyer in the United States of America. He's a partner at Whistleblower Partners. He's represented whistleblowers under every major whistleblower reward law for a decade. In his False Claims Act practice, Ari has successfully represented relators, which I think we think of as claimants, in lawsuits related to healthcare fraud, procurement fraud, and customs fraud. These include groundbreaking state False Claims Act lawsuits, in which Ari represented a whistleblower and dozens of government entities against 4 wireless carriers, and this resulted in a $138 million settlement and a 40% share for his whistleblower client. Ari also represents whistleblowers with claims under every reward program run by a federal agency. Ari has helped secure millions of dollars in awards for financial fraud whistleblowers under the SEC's program. Recently, he and his colleagues obtained a $24.3 million reward for a former Hyundai safety engineer, the first ever whistleblower award made by the federal auto safety regulator. Welcome, Ari. Very good to meet you.
But Ari, we're familiar with criminal lawyers, property lawyers, family lawyers, but we don't yet have whistleblowing lawyers in the UK. What is a whistleblowing lawyer, and why is this a specialist form of law in America?
So I represent whistleblowers in corporate fraud cases, and I call myself a whistleblower lawyer. But I want to be clear that there are sort of 2 different strains of whistleblowing lawyers when it comes down to it. One is individuals like me who represent people who report on fraud and other kinds of misconduct and seek to get a reward or a monetary award from a government agency that permits that kind of thing. The other strain is individuals who represent employees who have been retaliated against for blowing the whistle or exposing misconduct. Probably it won't surprise you to learn that most of my clients have both kinds of issues and claims. They have been retaliated against. They have been, action has been taken against them for the work that they, for exposing the misconduct that they have done. So on my side of the fence, though, the genesis of this kind of law really goes back hundreds of years to English common law, where there were effectively schemes set up to monetarily incentivize individuals to report misconduct to the government, to the king. And these are called quitams or quitams. Where an individual acts in the name of the government. And the United States actually set up such a statutory scheme many years ago during the United States Civil War, so in the 19th century. And the notion of it, again, drawing on English tradition, was to incentivize individuals to come forward with information about misconduct against the government. And the specific circumstances there was war profiteering. So you would have, contracts entered into in Washington, D.C. between the War Department and government contractors for cannonballs or horses or, provisions for soldiers, whatever it was. The contracts would be signed, but then they would be performed hundreds or thousands of miles away on the battlefield. And war profiteering occurred then as it does now. And you had cannonballs that were filled with sawdust and horses that had 3 legs rather than 4. that were being delivered on the battlefield. And so the notion was to provide soldiers and others with who had knowledge of this kind of fraud against the government to come forward without fear of reprisal. And the law sort of grew up from there into its modern form, where the False Claims Act, which is the law that I've been talking about, is what it's called, today recovers billions of dollars for the government each year. Most of that money comes in from healthcare fraud cases because there's so much government money that flows to the healthcare industry and healthcare institutions in the United States. But also, in industries as wide-ranging as defense contracting, private educational institutions, customs and tariff avoidance. It's very, very, very wide-ranging. And in addition to the False Claims Act, there have been, particularly since the financial crisis about 15 years ago, a number of federal agencies in the United States that have gotten authority from the United States Congress to set up whistleblower reward programs that incentivize individuals to bring forward information to them that help them to enforce the laws that they're responsible for.
So kind of incentivizing witnesses who might be reluctant to testify otherwise.
Yes. Incentivizing, yes. Witnesses or, just people with really percipient knowledge of the misconduct at issue. So
I was just wondering why it couldn't be dealt with under criminal law if we're talking about fraud, or is it just that it is a very specialist part of criminal law?
Well, so a couple of things. So the False Claims Act is a civil law in general. And while the reporting that my clients and other whistleblowers do under that law, they are proceeding under a civil law, the government does have the ability to bring criminal charges based on that information if the evidence supports a criminal charge. But the sort of recovery schemes under which individual whistleblowers are able to get monetary awards tend to be civil in nature. And with the regulators too, with the regulatory agency schemes, those two tend to be civil in nature. But again, if the information that an individual brings to the Securities and Exchange Commission, for example, which is the United States securities regulator, if it is so powerful and compelling to support a criminal charge, U.S. government prosecutors can bring that as a criminal charge, but the whistleblower sort of rights and entitlement to an award occur in a civil setting.
Thank you. And could you give us an example of the kind of case that, what kind of cases do you take on? And can you give us an example of something like that might fall within this remit?
Sure. Let me give you a couple of examples of false claims cases. This is necessarily going to be by way of example. But, so I mentioned that healthcare is a very, very big area of government contracting fraud. So one of the strains of case that we saw a lot of a handful of years ago occurred in skilled nursing facilities. So these are facilities where vulnerable elderly people, for the most part, reside. And people who, by definition, aren't able to take care of themselves, aren't able to, do the activities of daily living that all of us are able to do to maintain our independence. Many of these facilities are paid by the government to provide rehabilitation services. So it could be occupational rehab, speech therapy, things like that. And there is a sort of assessment scheme for how much rehabilitation you need. And there were, if memory serves, about 7 different categories that under the government's reimbursement scheme, each person would be classified into, and that would determine the amount of time that they were receiving therapy for each week. The highest need category was some hundreds of minutes each week of therapy. It also paid the most. And so the incentive that was built into that was that skilled nursing providers, therapy providers, would make more money, would receive higher reimbursement and make more money if they showed that their patients were sicker and needed more therapy. So that was what they did. So you'd have nursing facilities that would, let's say have 100 patients who needed therapy services, and lo and behold, 98 of them were at the highest category that was available. That doesn't mean that those individuals were getting that care. That doesn't mean that they necessarily needed that care, but they were being billed in order to earn higher reimbursements for the nursing facility. So that's an example of sort of billing for services that are unnecessary, billing for services that are not provided, which is very, very common in the healthcare setting, as an example. Another one I mentioned was customs fraud. And it's a little bit of a different strain or flavor, because rather than telling the government, making a misrepresentation to the government to get more money, you're making a misrepresentation to the government not to pay money. So importers in the United States, as in the UK, are required to pay duties and tariffs on products that they import. And it depends on what the product is and where it's coming from. Those would tend to be the two principal things that the government looks at. And so particularly during the Trump administration, when the tariffs on trade with China for Chinese products went way, way, way up, importers had a lot more incentive to lie and cheat and fib on the nature of their products and where they were coming from. And so, for example, what you would see, are things like double invoicing schemes. So you'd have an importer that would present to the government something that says, 100 units of this water bottle, we imported, and each unit costs $3. When in fact, they imported 100 and each one cost $6, and they kept 2 different sets of books, one presented to the government, another internally, in order to lower their duty burden. That's, a sort of another example of the kinds of cases. We see cases in the securities markets that have to do with accounting frauds, misrepresentations made to investors about the performance of companies, about the types of products that they're offering. Right now, a very popular thing is talking about the role of AI in financial services, artificial intelligence in financial service companies, product offerings to investors, and more generally, the sort of role of AI products. It again may not surprise you to learn that there's a lot of puffery is the nice way to state it. Misrepresentation, intentional misrepresentation that goes on about that. And then just to sort of round it out, there is, in many circumstances, in many of these kinds of cases, there's a distinct kind of public interest aspect to it. They do have to do with the health of individuals. They do have to do with the safety of the public. And the case that I would just sort of highlight in that regard The United States set up a vehicle safety whistleblower reward program in the last 10 years or so. Much of it was done in the wake of some very, very disastrous auto safety debacles with major global brands. And the whole purpose of it is to elicit tips and information from people who work for automakers that are hiding information about safety defects in their vehicles and not reporting those to the government because it's, in the automaker's estimation, too expensive or too risky to do so. So that's another kind of example on that score.
Can you help me out a bit here, because this is a very complicated field, I can see that, and it's not a field I'm very familiar with, but from what you've been describing, the provision of therapeutic supplies, as it were, or to do with the supply of ordnance or other military equipment, it sounds as if in both those cases, and I'm sorry I've put this in rather a convoluted way, you're protecting the institution there, and indeed in the last case you mentioned to do with import duties, in a way you're protecting the institution. So where does the whistleblowing aspect come into it?
Now, David, when you say the institution, do you mean the business that's committing the misconduct, or another entity, or the government entity?
Well, of course, that's a very good question. So, obviously, in the last of your examples to do with import duties, the institution would be the government, I presume, and with the health, well, again, in the health supply, again, you'll be representing the government. Is that correct?
So I think that the best way to think about it, so yes, that's right. And the best way to think about it is that particularly in the cases that have to do with fraud against the government, that are hurting, where the allegation is that they're hurting or otherwise harming the public fisc, the whistleblower is standing in the shoes of the government to recover its money, to recover money on behalf of the government. So the whistleblower has information about the government being harmed, and the whistleblower files a lawsuit in court to recover the government's funds. I think that's the sort of simplest way to think about it, to consider it. In the other agency programs, what I call the agency programs, where you have regulatory agencies that encourage tipsters to come to them, the scheme is a little bit different in the sense that there's no lawsuit that's being filed. It is literally, you, David, going to the securities regulator or to the serious frauds office in the UK and saying, here, I have this information about, so that such and such misconduct at so-and-so bank or brokerage house or whatever it might be. And then that regulator can do with your information whatever they choose, including to ignore it, which is hopefully not what they do. And that generally tends to be the helpful role of having a lawyer in the process as well, is to help to mediate that interaction between the whistleblower and the regulator.
Thank you. So do you see yourself as it were, providing the conditions whereby the whistleblower, or I think you use the term tipster, can come forward with information?
Yes, yeah, very much so. So, one of the very significant roles that a lawyer plays in this setting, and I would say a lawyer that specializes in this setting, is being able to take in a whistleblower's information what they know, the evidence that they have that is in sort of, hard documentary form, as well as their thoughts and experiences, and to assess the strength of that against the legal framework and against the sort of priorities and focus of the regulator. And then to take it and to package it up in such a way as to make it simple, persuasive, and ready for the regulator to dig into. It's sort of at one extreme of an example. It's one thing to come into a regulator's office and drop 10,000 pages of pieces of paper on their desk and say, "This is it. This is the smoking gun." It's quite another thing to have a 20-page white paper that walks through the key pieces of that evidence and explains what it shows and why it violates the law. So that's, just as a sort of an example. The other piece to add to it is that, again, I keep sort of toggling back and forth between the regulatory agency programs and the False Claims Act, which has to do with fraud on the government. But in the False Claims Act setting, whistleblowers are required to have counsel. They're required to have lawyers. And that is in large part because you're filing a lawsuit in federal court or in state court. So it's a more formal process and proceeding where you're required to have counsel.
But it sounds as if your work covers quite broad sections of industry, actually, in terms of, the examples you gave were great in terms of the diversity of what you're talking about. And certainly on the back of the pandemic, there's been a lot of controversy in Britain about PPE that either wasn't adequate or wasn't actually provided, and the millions of pounds that were wasted on it. So it sounds like within America that would fall within.
Very much so. I mean, COVID fraud was a huge part of what happened in the wake of the pandemic. And it has been a very, very significant priority for the U.S. government and for whistleblowers and whistleblower counsel. And there are legion examples of, like you said, personal protective equipment being sold that doesn't meet standards. In the United States, for example, there were billions of dollars that were provided to businesses to support them financially through the pandemic, where they had to certify certain, conditions in order to receive the funds that for many turned out to be not true, and things like that. So yes, very, very much so.
So what got you interested in this particular kind of law in the first place?
I have to dig deep into the recesses to reconstruct that. But my interest has always been from the perspective of corporate accountability. Before becoming a lawyer, I worked for a healthcare workers union, helping healthcare employees to form unions. And it was a formative experience in the sense that you learn very, very quickly that employees and individuals there's a great disproportionately amount of power that individuals have in the workplace as opposed to corporate management and corporate decision makers. And there are very, very few tools available to help to balance that out and to even that out in individual cases or more systemically. And I have been drawn to finding those tools and to honing them and figuring out how to use them. And these whistleblower reward laws are an incredibly, incredibly powerful means by which to hold companies accountable for certain kinds of misconduct. They're incredibly powerful, but in some ways very narrow. And one of the frustrating aspects of my practice actually is talking to a lot of people who want to bring forward information and report misconduct, but it does not fit for some reason or other the various programs that are available. And that's what I mean by it being powerful but narrow. It's not a sort of these laws aren't a sort of catch-all for corporate misdeeds, but where they do fit, they're very, very meaningful and material and powerful.
Thank you. And there is a group campaigning for an office for the whistleblower here in the UK, wanting to follow the lead of the US. Are there any other countries with the same kind of whistleblowing laws as America?
The same kind, I would say no. In terms of the scope and the breadth of those laws, the industries that they cover. Now, that said, there are several countries that have various kinds of whistleblower reward schemes, including your own. There are, I believe, two agencies in the UK, the Competition and Markets Authority, that currently has a whistleblower reward scheme for individuals who report illegal cartel activity. And the HMRC, His Majesty's Revenue and Customs Agency, has also a reward program that enables it to hand out awards to individuals who report tax fraud. But that's in the HMRC example, it is entirely discretionary to the agency. And in the Competition and Markets Authority example, there's a hard cap on the amount of the award. I believe it's £250,000 that the CMA can award. Other examples, most prominently what comes to mind is in Canada, the largest province, Ontario, has a securities whistleblower reward program that is largely modeled on the U.S. Securities regulators program. It has some notable differences, also includes a cap, but same idea. It's a sort of tip program that is built to give that regulator fresh and important information that it wouldn't otherwise have. South Korea has a tax whistleblower program as well as a whistleblower reward scheme for consumer protection violations. And then, as I understand it, India has a limited, at the federal level, has a limited securities whistleblower program for insider trading specifically. So violations of insider trading laws.
Thank you.
So it's not, there are other countries that and jurisdictions that have similar laws, but not that do in the same scope.
So, Ari, you mentioned that whistleblowers, if a case has legs and goes anywhere, whistleblowers have to have legal representation. But does that mean, or do they in any other way have some kind of legal protection?
Yes. So nearly all of these whistleblower reward schemes, one of the sort of foundational elements of them is a protection from retaliation. And retaliation is any form of adverse action that is taken against an individual who brings forward information that they reasonably believe constitutes misconduct or a violation of law. Now, what I just said differs in its particular jurisdiction to jurisdiction, but fundamentally, all of these reward schemes have within them or complementary to them another law that protects individuals from retaliation in the first place. And they work together to disincentivize employers and corporates from retaliating against individuals, and in the unfortunate but frequent circumstances in which they don't, they also the reward laws encourage and incentivize individuals to come forward with the information despite the fear and the consequences that that employers and management have wrought on the individual.
Thank you. So, Harry, you've given us an insight today into the many ways in which human beings will use their creativity to find a way to fiddle things. Do you think that some of these schemes that you've been describing can lead to fabricated allegations?
It's a really good question, and it's one that comes up a lot in debates about the sort of the wisdom or desirability of whistleblower reward laws. And I know that, in the UK, for about 10 years now, policymakers have been having this debate about whether to create US-style reward schemes or not. On this specific question, I will take a very, very firm position that the answer is no. And here's why. There are, in any smart policy that is built around a whistleblower reward scheme, and I mean a legislative policy, not a sort of corporate policy, there are going to be plenty of guardrails that are built in against that kind of conduct or misconduct, really. One, and sort of most importantly, is going to be requiring whistleblowers and people who come forward to certify under penalty of perjury that what they're saying is truthful to the best of their knowledge. And so you put somebody under the risk of criminal prosecution for coming forward with fabricated allegations. That tends to be an extremely strong disincentive. The second kind of set of guardrails that you have built in is the government, regardless of which type of scheme we're under, the False Claims Act or the agency whistleblower programs, the government always has very significant control over the information and what is done with it. So under the False Claims Act, where you have an individual who is coming forward and suing on behalf of the government always controls that lawsuit. The government can come in at any time and under a very, very low and easy to satisfy legal standard can move to dismiss that lawsuit. There are other ways in which the government has, under the law to limit the participation of the whistleblower. Under the agency whistleblower programs, the TIP programs, the government always has the ability to take the information and do absolutely nothing with it. They could review the submission, they could review the information, and they're done. That's it. So I think that those are two very, very sort of, basic but important guardrails that policymakers build in to guard against this kind of notion of fabricated allegations. I will tell you that it is, in my practice and my experience and those in that of my colleagues and the bar more broadly rather in the US, it's just not something that comes up with any kind of frequency. Having said all of that, I will say that they're an interesting and important backdrop to this kind of scheme where you're trying to provide incentives of various kinds for people to come forward with information that would otherwise remain hidden, is that the notion that it takes a rogue to catch a rogue. The government, in other words, has to be comfortable with the idea that people coming forward are not all going to be as pure as, as Mother Teresa. Many of my clients absolutely are. They're people who are sort of in the line of sight of something. They raise issues, questions about it, concerns, get retaliated against, and then things go from there. But sometimes you have circumstances where there are people who are part of the misconduct, involved in it in some way. And in the same way that criminal prosecutors work with witnesses, and work with individuals who are involved in misconduct to go after other individuals who are more culpable. These laws all sort of recognize that dynamic and know that it is something that may occur, and despite that, aren't turned off by it.
Thank you.
Sure.
So you've already mentioned how you feel that the regulations in the States are perhaps rather narrow, but nevertheless powerful, which is perhaps the opposite to how we feel about many of our regulatory bodies in the UK. I mean, a number of them have come under criticism, including those who control the price of power, the quality of water. Well, one could go on. Generally speaking, these are regarded as being rather weak bodies, which may offer regular critical reports, but don't really have much in the way of teeth. What do you see as being the difference between the two systems?
So I think that whistleblower reward schemes are not going to take an ineffective, unfocused regulator and flip it on its head and make it somehow different. What they will do is help to remedy a couple of problems that many regulators face. One is limited resources. So, I like to start with the good faith assumption that, people do their work in good faith and are trying to do what they're tasked with doing. And one of the things that stymies regulators in that is just not having enough bodies, not having enough people, not having enough analytical resources to work with. And so whistleblowers help to supplement that in a very, very powerful way by directing regulators with oftentimes smoking gun evidence of misconduct, right? It's the kind of stuff that regulators get in on day one with a whistleblower that would take them years to put together otherwise in an investigation that they started out from the outside. Besides kind of smoking gun evidence is a sort of a way to think about it is a map, a sort of a schematic of where the bodies are buried. So an insider knows all of a corporate, all the corporate systems, how the computers networks are organized, where files are located, who communicates with whom, are code words used, who was involved in the scheme and who was not, which is another thing that it could be incredibly powerful information and data points to target a regulator's efforts. And so, those are just a kind of a couple of examples of the way in which whistleblowers can make regulators a lot more efficient and to stretch limited resources significantly further than they might otherwise go. Than they might otherwise be able to go.
So it sounds as if resources is quite an important part of this. I was just thinking that we've just had several very good examples of not exactly regulation working effectively, but investigation working effectively with our post office inquiry and the current inquiry into the COVID. But they, of course, are massive, a massive organisation at work over a number of months and years.
Decades of calcifying misconduct, I suppose. Yeah. No, that's right.
So do you think the legalistic process we've been talking about it makes things too adversarial? Might there be a better way of going about it?
It's a really good question, and one that I think about a lot, because one of the criticisms of whistleblower reward programs is that they undermine corporate compliance programs, so internal reporting schemes and internal compliance programs within companies that are designed to allow individuals to raise concerns, to be protected doing that, and to address those concerns within the company. And that was actually one of the big arguments against the expansion of whistleblower reward programs after the financial crisis and the securities and commodities regulator programs that we have here. And I think that what has happened is that it's very much the opposite, in the sense that whistleblower reward programs and compliance programs, internal programs, work very much hand in glove and in concert. If you have a whistleblower reward program, it provides a very, very, very strong motivation to have a serious rather than a simple on-paper compliance program. Many companies thought that they can kind of slide by putting it on paper, writing down the policies, but when it came down to it and somebody emailed the compliance email inbox or called the compliance hotline, the sort of retaliation process would begin there. That is not, for more serious and more sophisticated companies now, that's not something that happens. They've gotten a lot more meticulous and a lot more serious about protecting the rights of employees. And a lot of that has to do with the hammer that they have to live with of simple logic. If we don't take employee concerns seriously, they're going to go to the securities regulator. And that's what the securities regulator says. The director of the enforcement division of the SEC recently said the question is not if, but when we're going to get the information. So you may as well deal with it at the outset, because it's going to be a positive attribute in terms of when you start to deal with us. It encourages more serious programs, and it's something that, in that sense, works together in a very, very complementary fashion. It's hard to say. One thing that I feel quite confident about is that simply having internal compliance programs and nothing else is a recipe for failure if the hope is to root out misconduct and fraud.
Thank you. One of the things I think you mentioned earlier about whistleblowers and recrimination, and that's quite common an experience. So people can really end up feeling very hurt and very angry. And the responsive organisations can also be pretty toxic towards whistleblowers. Do you ever feel like you're caught up in a very, angry world when you're doing the job that you're doing? You're caught up in the middle of a conflict, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a lawyer. My my day is spent in a very, very analytical fashion most days. But one of the things that makes this practice so interesting and so, kind of endlessly engaging is that it's at its sort of root level an extremely human experience of working with individuals going through some of the most difficult moments of their lives. I spend a lot of time talking to people, not about why they want to go forward with something and come forward with information and blow the whistle, but about why it may not make sense for them to do so. And the reasons for that are often far more plentiful than the reasons for coming forward. And they have to do with retaliation, discrimination, blacklisting, gaslighting, personal consequences of being unable to speak about something if you come forward, because under the False Claims Act, your case is filed under seal and you're not allowed to talk to anybody about it at penalty of losing your case entirely. And the consequences of whistleblowing, the sort of psychosocial consequences of coming forward and blowing the whistle, are extraordinary and profound. Depression, anxiety, higher suicide rates, alcoholism, other substance abuse issues. There are, study after study that has looked at this, concludes that whistleblowing is not good for your health. And that's a fundamental truth that I try to convey to all of my clients and would-be clients, more importantly. And it's really only at the end of that process of trying to weigh out the pros and the cons, can I be confident that somebody really wants to go forward with something for the moral reasons, for the, eyes open.
Thank you. Ari, you've got an interesting background and you've worked in or with trade unions in the past. It sounds to me as if you quite enjoy the challenge of your work. Am I right in thinking that?
There are a few things that I relish more than the work that I do most days. Yeah, but specifically, being able to hear somebody's story, to take that and the evidence that they have to support it, and to put it together in a powerful and compelling way, and present that to the government and help to, start and advance an investigation and represent and advise a client through that is incredibly rewarding and meaningful. And in the moments where I get to skirmish with adversaries, I have very, very few doubts about the rightness of my client's position, and I spend very, very little time up at night wondering about what I'm doing.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
You did also mention that you're working really with people whose lives may be very seriously disturbed and affected by what they go through. So how do you look after yourself in that regard?
This goes back to...
I was going to say running's not on for the moment. Obviously.
Yeah. I was going to say this goes back to something we were talking about a moment ago. No, that's it is exercise and personal time away from work, because it is and threatens to be a totally all-consuming kind of endeavor, and that's fine most of the time. But all of us need our time away. So. Exercise, quiet time around green things, that you could walk through like a forest, and spending time with my children and my family are things that sort of center and ground me most.
Thank you very much indeed, Ari, and thank you for bringing some more clarity, if not total clarity for me, about this really complex area of work.
Pleased to be able to do it, and if total clarity is what we brought, then we've exceeded our goals.
Thank you very much for joining us, Ari. Good to see you again.
Thank you too so much.